This is going to be a brief look at the history of life on Earth. So if we look to the origins of life, looking for the common ancestor of all life forms, that's a little bit tricky to define looking at the fossil record, because a lot of our oldest fossil organisms are already highly derived, very much more evolved than we would expect. But our very first fossils come from about 3.5 billion years ago, and they look to be like simple cells growing in filaments, looking a lot like today's cyanobacteria. And if we were to look at a phylogeny of life, there are three main quote unquote branches of life: eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. If we look at eukarya, that contains plants, animals, and multicellular fungi. If we look at archaea, that's our extremophiles. And if we look at bacteria, that's all of the bacterial organisms that we're familiar with today. But it's important to recognize that archaea is paraphyletic if we don't include eukarya. So really, they should be considered one group altogether, looking at an evolutionary standpoint. It's difficult to determine our first common ancestor looking at the fossil record alone, but our best estimate is around 2 to 4 billion years ago during the Archean era. At this point, we're looking back, and Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and this means that life must have appeared pretty quickly after Earth formed, so only 0.6 billion years right after its formation. Now, if we're looking at a history of life, our first multicellular organisms appear in the fossil record about 600 million years ago. This is the fauna that existed at that time. They were very soft-bodied, and they tended to be radially symmetric or bilaterally symmetric. And we have trace fossils from this time also present. And then we have the Cambrian explosion, which means that we had a whole giant radiation of diverse organisms in the Cambrian period. So essentially, there was an explosion of diversity during this time. This is when we saw representatives of major animal clades without any obvious precursors in the Ediacaran fauna. So some possible causes were rising oxygen concentrations, mass extinction of previous life forms, and interactions among organisms. Looking at the Paleozoic era, this had 5 different periods in it. So there was the Ordovician period, in which echinoderms, trilobite, and fishy vertebrates appeared, followed by the Silurian period, during the diversification of early fish and the beginning of terrestrial plants and arthropods, followed by the Devonian period, in which marine life diversified, seed plants began to appear, and we saw some more evolution of terrestrial vertebrates. During the Carboniferous period, there were extensive swampy forests, and many insects, amphibians, and reptiles diversified from here. In the Permian period, we saw diversification of reptiles and mammal-like reptiles, followed by a mass extinction. This was all followed by the Mesozoic era, which had 3 different periods within it. First came the Triassic period, in which reptiles, such as dinosaurs, and many mammals diversified, and then there was a massive extinction right at the end. During the Jurassic period, we saw the diversification of sharks, modern-day bony fishes, birds, and flowering plants like angiosperms. This was followed by the Cretaceous period, in which there was a radiation of dinosaurs, insects, angiosperms, mammals, birds, and then finally a giant mass extinction. The last era was the Cenozoic era. So first, looking at the Paleogene and Neogene periods, we saw that surviving groups from the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous were able to diversify. And these organisms included mammals, birds, snakes, angiosperms, pollinating insects, teleosts fish, first whales and sea lions, adaptive radiation of grasses, and even apes. This was followed by the Quaternary period, in which we had a series of glaciations, appearance of humans, and many large land mammals becoming extinct, which is part of our ongoing mass extinction event. So just to recap, looking at a geological time scale, we have the Cenozoic, which contains the Quaternary period. And I think I'm actually going to start at the beginning, not the end. So we're going to start with the Archean, in which we saw the diversification of archaea, prokaryotes, and the origin of life. Then the Proterozoic, where we saw the first eukaryotes, the first multicellular animals, and some of our oldest fossils. This was followed by the Paleozoic, in which we saw the Cambrian period, which is where we saw the first major clades of animals, followed by the Ordovician, where echinoderms were able to diversify. This was followed by a mass extinction. Then the Silurian, in which early fish diversified. We began to see terrestrial plants, and we began to see insects. This was followed by the Devonian, at which point we saw lots of seed plants, diversification of bony fish, and we saw the first amphibians, followed by another mass extinction. Then came the Carboniferous, where we saw our first winged insects, our first reptiles, and an extensive forest of early vascular plants. Amphibians during this time continued to diversify. Lastly came the Permian, where reptiles and mammal-like reptiles began to diversify, Pangea formed, and the largest mass extinction event in history was at the end of this period. Looking at the Mesozoic era, we had the Triassic, in which gymnosperms, dinosaurs, mammals, and reptiles diversified, followed by an extinction. Then the Jurassic, in which sharks, ammonoids, birds, and flowering plants diversified. Then the Cretaceous, in which dinosaurs, insects, angiosperms, mammals, and birds diversified. And then finally, we had a massive mass extinction in which ammonoids and non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. Lastly came the Cenozoic era, which had the Paleogene, in which grasses diversified, as did many animals and plants. Then the Quaternary. Then the Quaternary and the Neogene, in which grasses spread and the first apes came. And then we saw a series of glaciations, in which continents moved to where they are now, and modern humans evolved.